Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour to be a part of the program. It is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624. Send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening, Noah. Are you enjoying this weather that we've been having?
It's getting warmer, and we had this deep plunge in the middle of, and I went back to the air hurts my face, but now we're 50 and sunny, so I feel like we're good, and hopefully summer's going to fall on a weekend this year.
So that you can get to the beach.
The beach, right? Yeah, exactly. The lake. Sure, yeah. All right, let's dig into some feedback. Our first email comes in from Kevin. Kevin says, "Hi guys, I've used Graphene OS for a long time and I really like it. We use Microsoft Teams at work, and for a long time the team app worked great. At some point, maybe a year or so ago, it stopped working. During the sign-in process, after entering my email and choosing work account, the app says, no network. Please check your network connections and try again. The network is fine. And no other app is having any such problem. The app does have network permissions. And I've given it every other permission as well as trying to find an answer. Do you, or does the audience have any idea why this is happening? I assume it has something to do with Graphene OS, but I haven't an idea." So, Steve, you maybe didn't have the exact same issue, but you might be able to shed some light on this.
I had a similar issue with another app that I was using, and essentially it boiled down to needing to have the Play services installed and actually unsandboxed in this case, which was really untenable to me. What I tried was, I did try it, and it did work for a time. So I unsandboxed the Google Play services. I signed into the app. Then I sandboxed the Google Play services and shut it down. And that worked until the application updated itself, and then it broke itself again. And to which point I went, this is not worth my time. But I did end up digging around for Kevin, and I found other people with the exact same error across various OSs, including macOS and Android. And so I took that information, kind of went a little bit further, and found that some people were saying you have to be able to install the framework on your phone. I'm not exactly sure what the framework is. I assume it's not just the Play services, because the context was you have to install the Play services and the framework. So I assume it's whatever Office 365 framework uses to do their stuff and give it appropriate permissions. So I don't know. I wasn't able to find an actual resolution in the Microsoft link that we've got in the show notes, but you're not alone. So I don't know if that helps at all, but maybe someone else will write in and say how they've gotten around it themselves.
The path that I've been following, there was a music player. This is stupid, but I am a fan of the original iPod. I think it's one of the best products Apple ever made. It didn't require it didn't need an internet connection. It didn't have Wi-Fi. It just played music. It's a wonderful device, and I still use it. There's a GTK library that Steve was helping me work through some issues with, and I still use it. On my phone, there is a program called Retropod, and basically it makes your phone look like the original ClickWheel iPod, and I just like it as a music player. Tried to install it on Graphene OS. It installs just fine, launches just fine, but you go into the folders to actually find the music, and for whatever reason, no matter what permissions I give it, not unlike your story, just can't get it to work. In the end, my answer was, I can live without it, because if I've got to start making compromises, either you as an app are going to choose to live comfortably inside of your little box, not reach outside of your little box and give me whatever it is I'm asking you to do. If you're not willing to play by those rules, you just don't get to be on my phone. And I'm going to drive that train and see how long I can make it down the tracks before it crashes. But so far, I haven't really found anything I can't really live without. And so I'm kind of willing to take this one to the mat, Steve.
I just abandoned mine as well. And I guess if you can get around with working in a web browser, for example, or working around the issue, maybe that's the way to go.
So actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I also have struggled with Teams, right? It's one of those things where I would never in a million years pay for an Office 365 subscription. There's no way. And if that was true, if that was true 5 years ago, just on a principle basis, after I've seen the level of instability and abysmal support that accompanies it, now I'm 100% sure I would never, at least if it was critical and I had to be, would not trust it to Teams. That said, we live in the IT world. I don't always get to choose what meeting platform somebody else wants to meet on. So I guess I could be that guy who says, well, I work in IT and I use Linux. So if your Microsoft Teams doesn't work, you got to use my link. Here's a Jitsi link. I suppose I could do that, but I don't think it would be received very well. And so what I've chosen to do, take those things. They all tend to work in a web browser because in the end, there's somebody out there joining a team calls from a Chromebook. And so paste it inside of Google Chrome or Chromium or whatever makes you comfortable, Vandium, and away with you. And 9 out of 10 times it will work. You will be able to get to a usable thing by just using it inside of a web browser. But again, your choice if that doesn't work. I have taken Graphene OS, like Steve, all the way to if you give it enough things and make it enough like regular Android, eventually you can get it to run. Question becomes, what are you really accomplishing at that point? Second email comes in from Mike. Mike says, hi, Noah and Steve. I've been a long-time Linux hobbyist, nearly 10 years or so, and I'm always learning from you two. Thanks for what you do for the community. I'm really loving the recent dialogue around self-hosting and in VMs rather than bare metal. I'm currently migrating to a new server build, and I think VMs are the way to go. Snapshotting is a big reason for that, but currently have about 10 services hosted as Docker containers on bare metal. To answer Steve's next question, what's my end goal? I want to host the following for my family. And then he gives a list of everything from a media server to Nextcloud to image to a file share, all manner of things. And then he goes through and outlines his requirements rather nicely. Here's what I'm looking to do. Here's the applications I want. How would you architect this? How would you briefly set up these networks? How would you give this access to that? It's a very, very well laid out email, Mike, and we're deeply appreciative of it. We've discovered this week that it's going to very nicely dovetail with another project that Steve is working on. So if you'll allow us just a couple of moments, we'll circle back to your specific questions as we talk about them in a broader context. Donald writes in about CRXNG regarding the mention of CRXNG on episode 434. I'm using a Docker instance of CRXNG, and it does far more than just access your Google anonymously on your behalf. It actually has a built-in engine and has access to dozens of search engines, including those with specializations. It accesses those engines that it determines to be most applicable to your request. Of course, you can change that setting. You can configure it to your purpose. But I love it. I get better results from CRXNG, in my opinion, than from Startpage, which also sends those requests to Google anonymously. CRXNG rocks. Donald. So, Steve, have you heard and or played with CRXNG at all?
I have definitely heard of it. It's been on my list of things. I happen to have like a VPS that I got for, well, it's not a VPS. It's an actual like physical machine that I got for, like I'm renting it for really cheap because I got it on a Black Friday. Mm-hmm. I just keep it out there. I keep paying the $35 a year just because it was so cheap and I feel like I'm not going to get anything out there. I've been considering tossing it out there, honestly, so that it's publicly accessible, or at least over Tailscale. So
you have a machine that you're renting, a physical machine, for $35 a year?
Yep. It's I got it on Racknerd like before the pandemic, and it was one of those like it's not super powerful. I think
for $2.92 a month, how powerful do you need it to be?
I know, exactly, right? So anyways, it's hiding out there at Racknerd. I got one of their silly Black Friday sales one year, and I just held on to it. So
jeez, I thought like OVH and Kim Sufi was some cheap server, but you take budget to a whole new level, my friend.
Well, yeah, like I said, it's not got a whole lot of oomph to it, but I'll take it.
You know, there was an organization, I'm so irritated at them, I refuse to utter their name on the air, but they had a deal in which it was lifetime. You buy lifetime and we'll rent you this VM and then you have it for life. And I thought, you know, there's something I want to support. And so not only did I get like one VM, I was renting a bunch of them because I thought the more I buy in, the more that, the more money they'll have and the more I'll support this company and all the thing. Guess what? Guess how many of those VMs are still up and running? Guess how long they lasted? Very frustrating.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of April 6th, 2025, here's the Linux and open source news. The old venerable curl has released version 8.13. GNU Cache 5.11 is out. GNU Nano has announced version 8.4. apt 3.0 is now available. The Mozilla team has announced version 137 of Mozilla Thunderbird and Mozilla Firefox. KDE releases a bug fix update to KDE Plasma 6 version 6.3.4. Rust 1.86 is now available, and Qt 6.9 is also available. And NVIDIA has announced that NVIDIA PhysX and Flow are now fully open source. In open source security news, Outlaw is a Linux malware that relies on SSH brute force attacks, cryptocurrency mining, and worm-like propagation to infect and maintain control over Linux systems. Software supply chain security company Sonatype uncovered 17,954 open source malware packages during Q1 of 2025, the company revealed in its latest open source malware index. And in distro news, Slackware-based Portix distro has released version 2.0, and Fedora has announced their new project leader, Jeff Spalletta.
John Seeger, he is the VP of Engineering for Ubuntu and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah Show. John, welcome into the program.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you for making the time. So I understand that there are some changes coming to Ubuntu by way of the way that Rust is going to be involved. Can you talk about what those changes are and why those changes are coming about?
Yeah, indeed. So I dropped a blog post talking about an experiment we're going to run for Ubuntu 25.10, which is the release that will come out in about 6 months' time, where we're going to replace GNU Core Utils, which is the package that provides commands like cp and move and ls and chmod, with a new implementation of that package by a project called the UUtils project. And so the UUtils Core Utils project is essentially a complete re-implementation of GNU Core Utils, but written in Rust, not in C. It's a relatively new project, but they are at quite a nice level of maturity now. And they sort of notably have been striving for as close to 100% compatibility with the original GNU Core Utils tests as they can.
How do you respond to the argument that due to the licensing chosen, the Rust Core Utils uses MIT and the GNU one uses GPL3?
I recognize that's a bit of a change. There's been quite a lot of feedback on this since I posted it. The first thing I would say is don't read too much into that. The license was not a motive for the change. It's not indicative of any broader move from the GPL or from GNU software in general. Canonical, in fact, in general, when we write software, we use the GPL license and will continue to do so. In my view, the change in license here is relatively uninteresting since we're not the authors of the software anyway. We are a Linux distribution. Our role is to curate the very best of open source and ship it to our users in the most secure and efficient manner we can. At the moment, my view is that the maintainers of UUtils, the project community, has goals that are very closely aligned with our own, and so I see no issue shipping it. Of course, things can change, and should there ever be a situation where the UUtils project is no longer aligned with our goals, we can, of course, stop shipping it. I suppose it all comes down to trust. At the end of the day, we are essentially placing some trust in them, and our users place some trust in us as Canonical to ship, well-maintained, secure software. And we will continue working with the maintainers. I've had several conversations with them over the last few weeks. They're very engaged. They're interested in the project. So it's unclear to me how this could be perceived as a negative from a licensing front. From what I could tell, there's no financial gain for anyone to be had for us changing the Core Utils implementation. The main reason I would like to do it is on the grounds of kind of safety and resilience, and also a kind of active, maintained project with a new set of contributors that perhaps we've not reached before in Ubuntu.
Would you say that's the primary reason as to the why is the different set of developers?
Yeah, I'd like to try and reinvigorate the Ubuntu community a little bit. We haven't seen the growth we would like in the last few years. We have some long-standing, very active contributors to whom we owe an awful lot. But I would like to make Ubuntu the most attractive platform we can for developers from kind of all corners of the internet, if that makes sense. And so as we see other major projects like the kernel itself adopting more Rust, I would like to make sure that Ubuntu provides a first-class experience for that. And we, in fact, already have the Rust toolchain available in the Ubuntu archives, and we have a collection of snaps to make the developer experience a little nicer. But this will be an interesting test of that for sure. An interesting test in how we deliver Rust binaries and package their dependencies and those kind of things.
How close does the Rust core utils get to the full feature parity with core utils? And are there any obvious rough edges that a user should expect?
It's pretty close. They run a huge number of tests. There are a couple of things that we know already don't work. So one is a lot of the commands lack support at the moment for preserving or enumerating SE Linux contexts. So if you copy a file or move a file or list a file, the GNU core utils have a -Z flag, which allow you to kind of preserve or show SE Linux contexts. We've discussed with the utils maintainers. They're pretty confident that they can get that implemented in time for the feature freeze for the next release. The other thing is localization. So if you are using a non-English locale at the moment, you would definitely get a subpar experience. Things like sort, for example, might not sort in the order you were expecting if you were in France or Germany. And again, we're working on a plan with the project to have that addressed in time for the next release.
Could you talk about what timeline, if any, exists on this? What can Ubuntu developers and users alike expect by way of a timeline?
Yeah, so we're going to make this change in the archive the day the archive opens for Ubuntu 25.10. So in a couple of weeks from now, we'll release Ubuntu 25.04, and that will kind of officially open the archive for 25.10's development, and we'll make that change. So it will be the default in Ubuntu 25.10 right from the get-go in the daily builds, unless we have some major issue in that transition. My intention is to give this a real good go. There will be some rough edges. It'll be complicated in places. I remain committed to giving it a go. What I won't do is sort of naively press ahead if there are obvious issues with stability or performance or something like that. The idea is to get this working really nicely in 25.10 with the hope that we will ship it by default in Ubuntu 26.04, which is our next long-term support release. But again, if we ultimately find that there are too many incompatibilities or there are regressions that we find kind of unacceptable, then we will obviously have to roll that back. The other experiment we're doing, which is similar, is replacing the sudo command with a Rust rewrite. And that has some very attractive properties as well, in that clearly sudo is in the kind of critical path for security. And so the more eyes on that problem, the better. I think having that in a memory safe language makes a lot of sense. And the authors of that project are also in quite close contact with the original sudo maintainer, which gives me quite a lot of confidence.
Can you talk a little bit for maybe somebody who isn't a developer what a memory safe language is and what the benefits are to going to something like Rust?
Yeah, so in traditional programming languages like C, you are responsible for allocating and deallocating memory yourself. There are no real enforced checks for accessing, writing to, reading from memory. So there are certainly good programming practices and lots of projects that I can think of. Projects like curl and the Linux kernel itself have developed quite robust strategies for working with C and trying to minimize that. But nonetheless, a huge number of the vulnerabilities that we see in the wild are due to a bounds check not being quite right, or a developer missing something, meaning that memory can either be read or written when it shouldn't be. Perhaps two applications could overwrite one another's memory or read one another's memory, which can lead to all kinds of vulnerabilities, from information disclosure to remote code execution, etc. In Rust, you still have to allocate memory, albeit a little less explicitly. But critically, the compiler has a mechanism called the borrow checker, which essentially enforces a sort of one at a time ownership over values in memory. It makes it very, very difficult for you to read memory you shouldn't be reading or write to memory that is kind of out of bounds. There are limited ways to escape that with what's known as unsafe Rust, but that's much less common. And even then, there are some limitations. It's not quite as free as something like C. So that, plus the fact that the community around the Rust programming language has dedicated a lot of thought, a lot of time, a lot of effort into developing idioms and practices that mean often Rust code is much less vulnerable to this class of vulnerability.
What do you anticipate being the feedback / I'll say the pushback? What are some of what concerns, if any, do you have anytime you move people's cheese? There's going to be some people that will be excited. What do you anticipate that looking like, and how would you address any concerns?
So firstly, the existing packages that we ship today will still be available. We will provide clear documentation on how you can go back to GNU Core Utils if you wish, and how you can go back to OG sudo if you wish. Some of the criticisms are the binary size is a little larger, and so there might be a small increase in image size for things like Docker images, cloud images, that sort of thing. There may be some tricks we can play there to reduce the impact slightly. There have also been some concerns raised about the supportability of some of this code on more obscure architectures like PowerPC 64 or RISC-V. I'm actually pretty confident that that's going to be okay. We already build a huge amount of software from all kinds of different programming languages for those platforms. And I guess the one thing that's worth acknowledging is that there will be bugs. I'm not naive to the fact that we'll make this change, and there are enough users of Ubuntu that somewhere there will be use cases that we break. And all I can say is that we will be very committed to solving those problems and paying attention to those bug reports. And from what I can tell, the utils project maintainers and the Trifecta Tech Foundation, who are sort of sponsoring sudo RS, are very engaged and interested in this change. And I have every confidence that they will also respond well to that feedback and help us ship fixes.
His name is John Seeger. He is the VP of Engineering for Ubuntu and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah Show. John, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to come on the program and give us kind of a preview into what this looks like. I'm sure there'll be feedback, but I know that I speak for myself and a number of people from the Ubuntu community that say, thanks for having an eye forward to look to what's next. I think that's really encouraging. And as newer and cooler technologies come out, it's great to see that Canonical is at the forefront of adopting those technologies in a responsible way with the input and feedback of the community, making sure to not take options away from people, but improve the toolbox. I think that's really cool. We'll get you back on the program soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
A while back, I talked about an HP ProLiant server that I'm using for my backup server. I talked about putting it right next to the front door. That spawned an idea in Steve's head. That idea grew feet this week. Steve, tell me about it.
So it all started when, I suppose some time ago, I started talking with Noah about what he considers an off-site backup, right? Because ultimately, right now, my flow is I have a couple of external hard drives that I keep unplugged, and I only plug them in when it's time to do a backup. And I also have a cloud backup. And I was considering building a little shed in the backyard or something like that and putting power out there as my way of being off-site enough from my house, because it's not going to help, if a tornado rips through the area or anything like that, but it'll help against a fire. So I'd been having this conversation with Noah for, I don't know, a year or more, just back and forth, kind of kicking stuff around. And then he comes up on the show and tells me about how, oh yeah, I've just got a server that I stash by the door and I just grab the handle as I walk out. Like, oh, well, that would be good. Except that in my house, that's not feasible for where the exits are. And so from that, I decided to kind of move on my idea of shoving a backup server in an outbuilding, I suppose, for lack of a better way of putting it, so that I don't have to remember to grab the server on the way out the door. I don't know, it's several hundred feet from my house. So while it is possible that a raging inferno would burn down the building I'm thinking about, it is less likely, and I definitely would have a significant period of time to be able to walk over there and or run over there and grab the server and kind of run away with it. So
I tell you, here's the thing. First of all, I appreciate your grace. I appreciate the fact that you're just going to play along with me and assume that if the house were burning down, my top priority is going to, I mean, that's why I planned it out in my head, right? Oh, there's a fire. Let's all head towards the door, family. On the way out, let me open the closet and grab the backup server with all the data. If it all works out that way, I'll be as surprised and impressed as you are. Let's just say that.
Well, it's better to have a plan and only partially execute on it than not have a plan at all. So
100% of the people without a plan are the ones. Okay, so let's dig into a little bit about the specifics. You got my brain chugging along. So let's start here. And this is some of these are going to be a direct crossover with Mike. So before we can understand why you need a backup server or why you're choosing to do it this way, can you give us a brief recap of what your home infrastructure works? Let's start with, what do you consider to be absolute essential? Steve, house burns down. Steve walks into a new house. What things and in what order would Steve buy or reprovision things?
Ooh, that's a tough one. My knee-jerk reaction is Home Assistant, but if I walk into a new house, I probably don't have things to automate, so maybe it doesn't go on the high, like the very first thing, because there's nothing to automate at that point. As much as it is considered crucial in our current setup, but I suppose if the house burnt down and I move into a place brand new, so I don't have anything to automate.
Here's my counterpoint. If before you can automate a single thing, you're going to need a hub to connect it to. So it still stands to reason that Home Assistant, albeit very powerless if it was the only thing running, is still the most important thing. It's just the most important thing, and it's the first thing of the important things. Now we can attach other less important things to the most important thing, but we can't do that if we don't first have a solid base to build from. You see what I'm saying?
I do. I would say, honestly, resurrecting Confluence and Mealy are probably on the top priority, because that's spousal approval, and probably Wiki.js for myself and all the notes that I keep, right? Those they're kind of the unsung heroes here. All things considered, we really, really like Audio Bookshelf, and I actually donate monthly to them. It is an important project as well to us. However, if we had to, I do have my audiobooks backed up, and if I really, really had to, I could go back to Audible, which is where I buy my books from. So, I guess it would be those things that you forget that you use on a daily basis. So one of the things that I kind of added to the list is, we've talked about it before. I started to do another bake-off this week for Kanban boards.
Yeah,
for helping my track myself. There are several really, really good ones out there since the last time that I did this. I suppose they were out there before, but for one reason or another, I kind of eliminated them. I came back to WeCan specifically because I was looking for a feature called swim lanes, and I'm not going to get into that. That's going to take us down another rabbit hole.
Will it? If you're doing a large project, there's a bunch of different parallel things that have to oftentimes occur. The concept of swim lanes allows you to track each one of those parallel things in relationship to the project as a whole. Is that an accurate summation if you were to give a 30-second elevator pitch on swim lanes?
Yeah, I'd say my easy to understand way of doing this, I have two distinct ways that things come to me to come in to my plate to do. They either come in text form via email or Telegram or whatever, right? Some messaging platform, or they come in verbally. And so specifically for email, the way I've split it up is my swim lane is like, this came in verbal, this came in email, so that I remember which one of these things that I need to go back and figure out and reply to.
Well, sure.
Right? So my swim lane looks it's kind of weird from a project perspective, because who has email as a swim lane? But I have Monday through Friday on my Kanban board with verbal and email. And so the verbal things are like, have a meeting that says this, or the email is like, respond to the email of this person asking for this information. And so at any rate, that one would probably go on the top of my list for personal, and the other stuff that I've already mentioned would be on the top of my list for my wife.
Okay, so you have architected your servers how? Are they running in VMs? Are they running in containers? Both? And why did you go that route?
So all of the above. I guess the way that it breaks down is it depends, first of all, on how the project itself wishes to deploy its software. How hard is it for me to get that software to run on a VM or otherwise? And how much I want to protect that workload. So for example, I really, really want to protect Nextcloud. It gets its own island on a VM on its own host. That might sound a little silly, but the part of the idea here is Nextcloud is so critical to me personally that I need to be able to pick it up and move it, but I also don't want to have noisy neighbors that will trash it, right? So it lives on its own box, completely isolated inside of KVM for snapshotting, for moving it around if I need to, all that sort of stuff. But it lives by itself, like it's on its own dedicated thing.
So you have very powerful servers at your house. So it would be no problem, and then some on Sunday, for you to run Nextcloud, the Nextcloud VM that exists on your existing vHost with all them other things. And in fact, in some ways could be some benefit to that because you got all this other resources. But you say to yourself, it's so essential, I'm going to give it a dedicated box. It doesn't mean that you can't ever slide that Nextcloud puppy right back over to your vHost and run it there. But by default, all other things being equal, if the vHost dies, configuration changes, something goes down, whatever, Steve still has Nextcloud because it's on that box over there, the really important one, the one that its only function in life is to make sure that the Nextcloud VM runs. Is that what
exactly? Yep. And now, I've got the same thing for Home Assistant.
2 different boxes?
Yes, 2 different boxes.
Same. Let me phrase my question here carefully. Same make and model of box, or different choices for different purposes?
No, different choices for different purposes. The Home Assistant one's a little bit of a longer story, but that we'll digress into some other time. But no, the same purpose, where I want to be able to slide this around. I want it to be on a VM, but it also needs to not be impacted by bad things happening. I need to be able to take my vHost down without turning off the house.
Yeah, man. No, I'm right there with you. In fact, I'm gonna in a little bit I'm gonna dig into why I'm going to move further into your camp, I think. Okay, so a mixture of container or VM. So your choice, all things being equal, would just be to install an operating system and run the code on the operating system. And the most efficient way you know how to do that, and the most logical way for you that you would choose to do that, is with a VM. But sometimes manufacturers will say, I insist on running in a container. It's easier to run in a container. I prefer it that way. And you look at it and say, to reverse engineer what they have would be an uphill climb. So fine, I work with containers as a living. I'm an expert, in fact, in containers. If you absolutely insist I do it this way, I'll do it that way inside of a VM.
Yep. So I have delineation there between containers that need to have a GPU and other containers. So I actually have a VM that has a GPU dedicated just to that VM. And it runs things like image. It doesn't run the full image. It just runs the processing part of image that fires off as a job. It runs Frigate so that Frigate has direct access to the GPU. It also runs like an LLM for Home Assistant, so that whatever, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I have 2 VMs that are chunky, like unreasonably large for a home lab for VMs, because I just toss all the containers on there, and then I front them with Apache. I know the cool kids use Nginx. I tried. I just keep falling back to Apache because I've used it so long that I understand it, and whatever. It works.
Here's the thing: you're probably wise to just hang out in Apache land, because all the Nginx kids, they're teenagers and now they're growing up to be Trafic kids. And so you never know, Steve. It's going to keep changing. The world's ever evolving. So, okay. All right. So why do you have a separate VM, or do you have one VM that is the Docker VM? I'm sorry. You explained that. You said you divide them into GPU, non-GPU. So is it 2 VMs then, a GPU VM and a non-GPU VM?
Yep.
Okay. And the strategy there, I presume, is just a function of it needs access to those resources, so it goes on a container there. That doesn't need access, so it goes over there. If that wasn't the case, there'd just be one VM that runs the containers.
Yeah. Yep. Pretty much. There's something to be said for having too much condensation for, things, because if that VM goes down, all of those hosts go down.
Absolutely. But is that a point where you would say, as you watch the resources, though, you would get to a point and say, okay, now I'm at a point where I've got enough of these puppies. Now we're going to have container host 1, container host 2.
Probably not. I mean, I still, like we talked about, I still default to running things in VMs. But one of the things I wanted to circle back to is the idea of what do you do with the data and how do you protect the data? Because one of our people that wrote in about their server setup was asking things about like doing the snapshot or how do you manage the data. The way that I do it is a couple of different ways. So each one of my containers actually gets its own segmented part on the NAS, and either it's done through NFS or it's done from there's either the VirtIO or the 9P driver that pass in direct block devices from the host. And the decision there from my perspective is I'll default to NFS unless we have a system that needs direct access without worrying about file locking. So if you've got something that is writing a database, you don't want that over a network. You don't want things like, so Prometheus with its WAL files, or you probably don't want Image's database over NFS and stuff like that. So there are some projects that actually have a recommended way of handling the storage for their application, and you should pay attention to that. But what that allows me to do is I have them on different data sets on the ZFS backing, and I have snapshots that are configured for, so Plug for Sanoid, really love that tool. Helps you automatically configure and take snapshots at whatever intervals, and it ages them out. Perfect tool. Love the tool. Jim Salter, if you ever listen, thank you very much for that tool. So that saves a big headache. So in terms of protecting the data, I heavily rely on ZFS snapshots. I do take snapshots of the VMs, but not as a way of protecting the data. It's like I'm about to try something risky on this VM and I know it, so take a snapshot and then roll it back if it goes badly.
A fire extinguisher.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so we have a pretty good idea of what you're looking at now. The data is what's valuable to you. You recreate or want the ability to host VMs, and you want the ability to host containers. So you sought out to buy a piece of hardware that primarily, if I'm understanding you right, is a place that you can stick out in the shed to a place to dump all the stuff. So if the house burns down, you got all the data backed up out in the shed. But also, you're looking for maybe a little bit of oomph so that if you had to spin up a couple of the, you want to get Wiki.js, you want to get the Mealy back up, you want those things, they have the ability to get back up. What did you settle on? What did you buy?
So I ended up buying Supermicro motherboards because I tend to really have good experiences with them. My original OG NAS way back in like 2010 or something like that was a Supermicro board, and I was just like, this thing is fantastic. Like
they just don't die.
Exactly. It's still running. It's still sitting down there.
My current file server is built, and this is I built it. I built, I think 2015. So it's 10 years old and still running like a champ. Same exact story as what you're describing. I was blown away by, I just plugged it in and it's worked ever since. And oh, by the way, my wife, for whatever reason, moved the washer and dryer into my network operations center. Apparently that's where the people, when they built the house, they put the connection for the washer and dryer in my network. Anyway, I don't know. It's a weird building thing from the 60s, I guess. But in any event, it means that file server sucks in unbelievable amounts of lint and all manner of garbage. It just keeps on trucking.
Man, do I love the Supermicro stuff. The one that I bought back in 2015 actually has dual 10 gig Ethernet ports, even from way back then. And so they're not cheap. They're never going to be cheap. This is not a cheap option. This is I want this thing to just do its job option, and you pay for it. You know, the IPMI works really well on these guys. It does what I need it to do. And
console access, or just like restart the box kind of thing, or like I can get to a screen and actually click around and type around.
Oh no, you can click around. They support the KVM over HTML5.
So let's have a brief detour here. So the Dell version of this is iDRAC. iDRAC comes in a couple of different flavors. There's basic iDRAC, which lets you log into the UEFI. It'll let you power cycle, but you can't get console access. You want console access? That's an enterprise license. You got to buy that from Dell. Oh, by the way, not all iDRAC comes with an enterprise license, so sometimes you got to pay extra for that. Instead of going down that route, I chose to use an open source solution called PiKVM. PiKVM is great. You plug in the HDMI cable or the VGA or whatever in the back is, you plug in the USB, and then you take the little science project looking things and connect pins to the motherboard, and it supposedly can do all of the things that a enterprise KVM can. And it does. And I'll be honest with you, it does work. But, and there's a big but, it doesn't have the right connector, well, you got to go use a converter or a thing. And then that changes how it renders inside of the browser. And if you want it to be able to power cycle and do power buttons, then you got to open the boards up and plug things. Not a big deal if you're using a motherboard or, but if the motherboard isn't designed to have the little individual pins, and it's designed because it's just like a Dell server kind of a thing, and they just have some proprietary connector that plugs in, it very quickly goes from a solution that I was supposed to plug in to control the computer to a bad-looking science project that has all manner of octopus wires coming in and out of the case to try to get the thing to work. And all that to say, it's a great solution. I'm glad it exists. It absolutely does work. If you want something open source top to bottom that you can build out of commodity hardware, check it out. But it comes with some compromises. So it sounds to me like you went the route of you didn't have to pay anything. It just came with the motherboard, and it just, works.
So, yes, all of the above. I wouldn't say I wouldn't have to pay anything extra. You pay for the feature. Like the Supermicro boards, this is my third active Supermicro board, and they are not cheap. Like the one that I bought, granted, it does have an SoC on it, but it clocked in at like $600. Like not cheap, just for the bare bones.
Where did you get it, if you don't mind me asking?
I got it off of Amazon. You can get them a bunch of places, and ultimately, the only reason I went with Amazon this time was just because I already had a giant cart full of other things that I needed for home renovation. So it was just toss it on the pile sort of thing. Generally, we try to actually spread our load not to Amazon, just as a way of making sure other people still exist in the world. But yeah, that's for another day, I suppose.
Okay, so you said it has an EPYC on board. Talk to me about that decision. You could have gone two routes. You could have just built, even a Supermicro. You could have built a Supermicro server. Why the SoC? Actually, let's back up. What is an SoC? What's different between an SoC and what people know as a regular motherboard where you add all of the components in?
So SoC stands for System on a Chip. And that's where basically they solder the processor directly on. Generally, I'm not in favor of this, except this is a NAS and it's an appliance. So there's a couple advantages usually to an SoC in terms of once it's baked into the motherboard, there's a lot of advantages that has as opposed to trying to be able to support something that's modular. In this case, it's a 30 watt TDP, which for what I want it for is kind of important, right? I wanted something that can handle a decent load. So it's got 8 cores, but at the same time, when it's just sitting there idle, because it's going to be idle 99% of the time, I hope, it really just sips the power. And that was kind of the purpose.
Okay, so you land on a Supermicro SoC. So the processor comes, so really all you're adding is what? Case, power supply, and RAM?
Yep. And hard drives, obviously.
Right, disks. Well, let's circle back to disks. So what did you choose? How much RAM? What kind of case did you get? Or are you doing a case? And what power supply? And new or used?
Yeah, so all things new because... So I have a bunch of power supplies kicking around. And the only thing that I'm going with used here is the RAM, and because the RAM is probably not going to fail very much. But since it is going to be sitting outside, I do have power supplies that are, I don't even know how old. And then I thought, I'm spending like $1,200 between the motherboard and the discs. I probably want to put something that's going to be reasonably reliable, or at very least, if the power supply dies, I want to be able to like address that quickly. So, I ended up going new with those. In terms of what specifically I went with, again, because it's an SoC, I went and looked for a modular power supply that had a decent rating. I don't need tons of power. And I ended up with a 650 watt MSI mag, which is a semi-modular power supply. You can go look it up if you want to, but I don't need many cables, which is why I wanted the semi-modular. I actually wanted full modular, but you pay for that. So, in terms of other components, I guess I went with a Thermaltake Core V1 mini ITX cube case. And the reason why I did this, there are other smaller cases, but I wanted to have a little bit of space in there. I wanted to be able to put a regular power supply instead of needing a small form factor power supply, and wanted to have room for a few discs in there. And so I went that direction. And aside from that, everything else is kind of boring. The hard drives I actually did, because it is a backup server, this is the one compromise I made. I am going to try the Amazon Renewed policy.
Really?
Yeah. Well, because they are enterprise hard drives with 5-year warranty through the Amazon Renewed, and so
you're in theory. I'm saying back what I think you're telling me, just so I make sure I'm understanding, and so that the audience makes sure they're understanding. What you're basically saying is, in the end, no. Again, assuming everything goes according to plan, nobody's hammering these drives. They're getting their backup, or they're getting data synced over them in a controlled, scheduled fashion. And when and only when you need something, in theory, you'd go back. And even then, it's not, people aren't going to be hammering them then. We're just going to pull the data back off of them onto whatever the new thing is. So you're never going to trust drives, no matter if they're brand new or used. You're always going to have the data in 3 places if you really care about it. And so this becomes the most cost-effective way to make that data exist in a third place at the least possible dollar with the least possible compromises. That's kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, ultimately, this is going to live in a ZFS mirror, right? And so I felt like the amount of money that it costs to get a brand new 20 terabyte drive versus these ones ended up costing $280 a piece. So I thought, well, ultimately, I'm going to beat them up the same way that I did last time. We kind of talked about on the show how I used rsync as opposed to the ZFS send and receive.
Me too.
Specifically so that I could beat them up, right? I want to hammer these drives as much as I can, and while the ZFS is significantly more efficient at transferring the files, that's not the purpose of this.
So, okay, we understand what you're looking to back up. We understand how you arrived at the conclusion and of the hardware choices. What operating system are you going to install on it, and what is going to actually run on the backup server? Will it just be a bare bones OS with rsync running? Will there be any ZFS things? Will there be any virtualization? Will there be any containers?
So for the OS, I've been really kicking this around. So generally speaking, your backup server should be different from your main server if your purpose is to not have a clone, right? If you're trying to do a hot spare, you want it to be like for like. However, if you have a backup server, generally speaking, you're trying to do your best to avoid bugs and stuff like that. So if you're running RHEL on your main machine, maybe you run Ubuntu on the backup machine so that you're not impacted by the same. Like if a crippling bug takes out your data on RHEL, for example, you want to make sure that you don't have the same crippling bug in your backup system. Mm-hmm. That's just general good practice. Now, that's not enterprise practice. I want to be clear about that. We have some very large clients that do actually follow this, where they specifically run a heterogeneous environment so that they are not impacted by, like, one bug can't just take down their whole system because they've kind of spread that around. In this case, my main NAS is running Ubuntu, and I was going to do RHEL. I think I'm going to do Arch, and the reason for that is because I looked into how I would do ZFS on root so that I'm doing root snapshots, and you can do it, but it looks like quite the lift. And I'm like, I've already worked out and have a playbook for how to do this for Arch. So maybe I'll just go that route.
Yeah, and that was let's be clear, that was no easy feat. That was a weekend project, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about, that was getting the encryption working on that. I'd worked out the ZFS on root some time ago, and I don't remember how long that took me because that was just kind of messing around. But yeah, ultimately, I probably will go Arch. What I haven't figured out is whether or not, I don't think I'm going to encrypt the backups, but I'm not sure. This is my lack of knowledge. I've not played around with a lot of the encryption. I don't know whether you can have a drive like ZFS pool that's encrypted but active, so that you can send and receive, like, so that you can receive snapshots from an unencrypted source. So like my main NAS is not encrypted, but if I'm sticking this outside in the wild, I probably want it encrypted so that when somebody yanks it out of the wall and it like disconnects, when they boot it back up, they can't get at the drives.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple different ways to handle encryption. I'll be interested to see how you do that. One school of thought, which I'll be honest with you, and it's probably, I admit it's my technical ignorance, okay? I admit that up front. One school of thought is to use the TPM chip to seed the encryption, and so the device can boot up on its own. The other way is you do a typical passphrase where the key isn't necessarily there, but then every time you start it up, you got to go type in the password. So I'm curious which one of those routes you plan to take, and what problems, if any, you see with it.
Well, I would just like to point out that I specifically went to get an IPMI. So I think that's an indication of the way that I'm likely to go. The only other thing that I would consider is you can set up a Tang server such that if a computer is on your local, like on the proper LAN, it calls out and then can decrypt its drives on its own, so that if somebody steals it and they plug it in, it boots up, and then the hard drives stay encrypted because it doesn't actually have the counterpoint on the LAN to say, go ahead and unlock yourself. But I don't know that I'm going to go down that route. We'll see.
So here's what I'm going to ask your help with as you walk down this path. There's a couple of things that you have told me that jump straight out of my earphones right in the front of my face. And the first is the concept of having these dedicated machines to run your most essential infrastructure. I cannot begin to tell you the level of peace I immediately begin to feel as I start to process through the idea that all of these things could, because they're all QCOW2 files, run on top any vhost that is running any operating system that can run libvirt. But you have chosen to build two such systems for the purpose-built reason of running your appliance. So that appeals to me. And after 7 years, I think I'm finally ready to migrate my Home Assistant from a development environment into a production environment. And as I do that, I think I want to follow in your footsteps by way of having a dedicated PC appliance that acts as a host, that then runs a VM, that then runs Home Assistant. To me, that feels like the right way to go. I am going to be reconsidering how I do everything, from how I wire Home Assistant to how things connect to Home Assistant to what runs on Home Assistant, how it's backed up. And to the extent that you have stubbed your toe on some of those things ahead of time, I'd love to hear on where you think my blind spots are. That'll have to be another episode, because the music in my ears, that means we're out of time. I appreciate you joining us. We meet every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central, AskNoahShow.com. If you like the show, you can catch the back catalog at podcast.asknoahshow.com, or you can follow us on X. I'm at Colonel Linux. He's at Linux Ovens. The show is at Ask Noah Show, but we're back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central, AskNoahShow.com.